The Trojan War was perhaps the most famed military conflict of the ancient world, traditionally dated to the early 12th century BCE. But a lesser-known fact is that the generation before, during the 13th century BCE, Troy was attacked by an earlier expedition of Greeks as a part of a brief Achaean-Hittite war over the influence and control of the city of Ilion. According to the ancient Greek mythology and tradition, this early expedition was undertaken by none other than the greatest Achaean hero, Heracles. The early 13th century BCE was a turbulent time in western Anatolia. Since the Trojan War at the end of the previous century, the Hittite Empire was the established hegemon of the region. This did not sit well with the Mycenaean kings who had traditionally held their own sway over this area, especially over the now conquered Arzawa. When the ruler of Troy, Alexander, signed a treaty with the Hittite king Muwatalli II around 1280 BCE, it was clear that Mycenae would certainly react. The treaty guaranteed that Alexander's successor would be protected by the Hittite Empire against all of his potential rivals and, if necessary, even the people. In return, Troy acknowledged the hegemony of the Hittite Empire and agreed to, if necessary, provide Hatti military support in western Anatolia in case of conflict. At Mycenae, these actions by the Hittites were viewed as unacceptable as the political order of western Anatolia was being radically changed at the expense of the Mycenaean Greece. It was time to act. A significant military force was dispatched to Miletus in a show of strength that encouraged the anti-Hittite insurrections in the area. Although conquered by the Hittites and afterwards split into 3 clan states, the former land of Arzawa still held strong anti-Hittite sentiments, and none of the Hatti clans succeeded in pacifying the region. In the newly developed situation, it seemed that another conflict between the Achaeans and Hatti was on the horizon. The war came sooner than everybody expected, as the newly crowned king of the Hittites, Hattusili III, decided to make a surprise move without any prior declaration of hostilities. As the Hittite army approached the Achaean territory, the Mycenaean army was quickly alarmed, and the two powers once more met each other at the field of battle. Although ambitious, Hattusili III was still a young and inexperienced ruler and was himself surprised by the presence of the full-fledged Achaean army stationed nearby. The Hittite forces were routed, and Hattusili was forced to retreat back to his territory. The Achaeans did not pursue, instead relying on the Arzawan renegades to keep the Hittite hands tied in the area, chief among them the Anatolian warlord Piyamaradu. Subsequently, an expeditionary force was dispatched towards the north. After the passing of Trojan ruler Alexander, The city was in turmoil regarding his successor, and the Mycenaeans were eager to install a person close to their own interests and opposed to the hegemony of the Hittites. After a brief battle, the city was taken by the Achaeans and the Trojan ruler deposed and likely put to death. The Hittite sources do not mention any of the names in this conflict, but according to the Greek mythology, the Trojan ruler was named Laomedon, and the general leading the Achaean forces was Heracles himself. As it always is with the events preserved through the orally passed stories, very little of it actually gets preserved, as many of the information disappears from memory over time and many fictional things get eventually added to the story. According to the ancient historians, these events corresponded to the reign of King Eurystheus of Mycenae, son and successor of Sthenelus. In Greek mythology, at some point during Heracles' service under Eurystheus, the king of Troy, Laomedon, was indebted to Heracles for slaying a sea monster Katos on behalf of the Trojans. When the time came for the great hero to get his promised reward, which were the horses that Zeus himself had previously gifted the Trojans, King Laomedon went back on his word and refused to honor his promise. Heracles then left Ilion empty-handed, but not after promising to return and make war on Troy. Upon completing his initial tasks, Heracles started gathering his forces for the Trojan campaign, with his chief lieutenants being Telamon and Eucles. The 18-ship-strong fleet was assembled, and an Achaean expedition was launched by the great hero against Laomedon and the Trojans. Upon landing on the coast of Troy, the initial Trojan guard was quickly defeated and positions secured by the Achaean forces. Heracles then set out to attack the city, leaving the guard of the ships to Eucles. King Laomedon decided to conduct a surprise attack and sallied out with his army, directly attacking not Heracles but the ships guarded by Eucles. In the subsequent battle, Eucles was killed, but the Achaean troops kept their positions, and Laomedon was not able to break through and reach the ships until they were safely moved away through the sea. The forces of Heracles then returned, hard pressing the Trojans and forcing them to return within the city walls. After a brief siege, Telamon was able to breach the wall, either by having help from inside the city or the divine intervention. After Telamon, Heracles entered the city with his forces, and the Battle of Troy broke out between the invading Achaeans and the Trojan forces of Laomedon. As the Achaeans got the upper hand, King Laomedon was shot down from an arrow of Heracles and killed, with many of his sons also being among the fallen. The Achaean expedition under Heracles thus sacked the city of Troy, slaying many of the family members of the fallen king. However, one person that was spared was Laomedon's young son Podarches, who was ransomed by his sister Hersione. Podarches would become better known as Priam and would eventually go on and become the new king of Troy. According to the Hittite sources, this sack of Troy led the great king of Hatti, Hattusili III, to declare war on the Achaeans, and the Hittite imperial army was dispatched to Ilion under General Casu. Now the sources on this battle are scarce, but according to the later Hittite letters, the outcome was inconclusive and not really favorable to the Hatti, leading to much blame to the nearby Hittite vassals for failing to provide military support for their overlords. Either way, the peace agreement was soon made between the king of Hatti and the king of Achaea, and the Greek forces subsequently left Ilion and sailed away. Although everything was resolved without further escalation, and it appears that Troy was still under the Hittite influence in the following decades, it was at least from this period, although probably earlier, that the Hittite kings clearly referred to the Achaean rulers as brothers, fellow great kings, their peers, and equals to their own power. Those designations were in Hittite terminology only reserved for the great powers of the Bronze Age, such as Egypt, Babylon, Mitanni, and later Assyria. However, despite these designations and nominal friendship, the Hittites were far from being left alone, as the Achaean-sponsored insurrections in western Anatolia only increased and culminated into further wars in the following period. Please consider subscribing and sharing this video, as this is a one-person production and it greatly helps the visibility of the channel. Special thanks to History with Sai, Nico, and the State Care for their continuous support. If you wish to become a Patreon member, feel free to click the link in the video description. This was WanaxTV, and we'll see you again soon.